The hammer struck the rusted padlock for the third time before it finally gave way, sending fragments of corroded metal scattering across the rocky ground. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead and stepped back to examine their purchase with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. The mine entrance loomed before them like a dark mouth carved into the mountainside, its wooden support beams weathered by decades of abandonment and exposure to the elements. His younger brother Daniel stood beside him, holding the property deed they had received just hours earlier at the county auction, the paper already creased and worn from being folded and unfolded countless times during their drive to the remote location. The auction had been unremarkable at first, filled with the usual assortment of foreclosed properties and abandoned lots that attracted bargain hunters and real estate speculators. Marcus and Daniel had attended out of curiosity more than serious intent, browsing through the catalog of available properties while nursing lukewarm coffee in disposable cups. The mine listing had caught their attention because of its unusually low starting bid and the peculiar notation in the description that read, "Sealed by previous owner, interior condition unknown." Something about that mystery had sparked their entrepreneurial instincts, and before they fully understood what they were doing, they found themselves in a bidding war with only one other interested party, an elderly man who dropped out when the price exceeded $5,000. Now, standing before the actual property with the afternoon sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, Marcus felt the weight of their impulsive decision settling on his shoulders. The mine was located nearly 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a deteriorating dirt road that had tested the suspension of their pickup truck for the better part of an hour. Dense forests surrounded them on all sides, the silence broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead and the whisper of wind through pine branches. According to the limited historical records they had managed to locate, the mine had been operational during the early 20th century, extracting copper and small amounts of silver before being abandoned when the veins ran dry sometime in the 1930s. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button and consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It really helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. And drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Daniel moved forward to examine the entrance more closely, running his hand along the rough-hewn stone that framed the opening. Heavy wooden beams had been installed to reinforce the entrance, though many showed signs of rot and insect damage. What immediately struck both brothers as unusual was the metal door that had been installed sometime long after the mine's operational period. Unlike the rusted industrial-style barriers they had seen at other abandoned mining sites, this door appeared relatively modern, made of heavy steel with reinforced hinges and multiple locking mechanisms. Someone had gone to considerable expense and effort to seal this entrance, and the padlock Marcus had just broken had been a high-quality model, not the cheap hardware store variety one might expect on a long-abandoned property. The door itself resisted their initial attempts to pull it open, the hinges groaning in protest after years without movement. Marcus retrieved a crowbar from their truck, and together the brothers applied leverage until the door finally swung outward with a prolonged metallic shriek that echoed across the mountainside. A rush of stale air emerged from the darkness within, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else neither brother could immediately identify, a faint chemical odor that seemed out of place in what should have been a simple abandoned mine shaft. Marcus clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight and directed the beam into the darkness beyond the threshold. The entrance tunnel extended forward approximately 15 feet before opening into what appeared to be a larger chamber. The walls showed the rough marks of the original excavation, chisel marks and drill holes still visible in the rock face despite the passage of decades. But what immediately caught their attention were the more recent modifications to the space. Someone had installed electrical conduit along one wall, the gray plastic tubing running the length of the visible tunnel before disappearing into the darkness ahead. Wooden planks had been laid across the floor, creating a walkway over the uneven ground, and the boards appeared far too well preserved to be remnants from the mine's original operational period. Daniel entered first, testing each step carefully before committing his full weight to the makeshift floor. Marcus followed close behind, sweeping his flashlight beam across the walls and ceiling, noting additional details that reinforced their growing suspicion that someone had used this space long after the mine ceased its legitimate operations. Modern expansion bolts had been driven into the rock at regular intervals, suggesting that equipment or storage systems had once been mounted to the walls. The electrical conduit they had observed from the entrance continued deeper into the mountain, professionally installed with proper mounting brackets and junction boxes at regular intervals. The entrance tunnel opened into a larger chamber that had likely served as a staging area during the mine's operational years. This space measured roughly 30 feet across and perhaps 20 feet high, with several smaller tunnels branching off in different directions. But the original mining infrastructure had been extensively modified. In one corner, someone had constructed what appeared to be a storage area using pressure-treated lumber and plywood, creating enclosed compartments that still contained empty shelves and hooks mounted to the walls. A workbench occupied another section of the chamber, its surface scarred and stained but still structurally sound. Tools had been mounted on a pegboard behind the bench, though most had been removed, leaving only the outlines where they had once hung. What disturbed Marcus most profoundly was the living area that had been established in the largest section of the chamber. Someone had brought in a metal bed frame, now stripped of its mattress but still fitted with the springs that had once supported it. Wooden crates served as furniture, arranged around a small folding table that remained standing despite its obvious age. A camping stove sat in one corner, connected to a propane tank by a rubber hose, and nearby stood several 5-gallon water jugs, long since emptied but positioned as if they were part of an organized supply system. Whoever had occupied this space had not been a casual trespasser or curious explorer. They had established a genuine living quarters underground, complete with the basic necessities required for extended habitation. Daniel's flashlight beam swept across the far wall and stopped suddenly on something that made both brothers freeze in place. Someone had created a crude map by scratching marks directly into the rock face, a network of lines and symbols that appeared to represent the mine's tunnel system. Certain passages were marked with X shapes, others with circles, and a few bore notations in a handwriting neither brother could decipher from their current distance. But more disturbing than the map itself were the newspaper clippings that had been affixed to the wall nearby using some kind of adhesive that had left permanent stains on the rock. Though the paper had yellowed and become brittle with age, the headlines were still partially legible, and what Marcus could make out sent a chill down his spine. The first clipping appeared to be from a local newspaper, dated nearly 15 years earlier, with a headline about a missing person investigation. The photograph accompanying the article was too degraded to make out clearly, but the text mentioned a suspect who had disappeared shortly after being questioned by authorities. Another clipping, positioned slightly lower on the wall, came from a larger regional paper and discussed what appeared to be a series of property crimes, though the details were obscured by water damage and deterioration. A third article, the most recent based on its better preservation, mentioned an ongoing manhunt for an individual wanted in connection with multiple offenses, though again the specific details remained frustratingly unclear. Marcus moved closer to examine the clippings more carefully, his mind racing to process the implications of what they had discovered. The person who had sealed themselves inside this mine had not been conducting legitimate business or engaging in innocent activity. Someone had transformed this abandoned mining site into a hideout, establishing a self-sufficient living space complete with power, water storage, food preparation capability, and enough organization to suggest extended occupation. The newspaper clippings suggested this individual had been following news coverage of their own case, tracking the investigation and perhaps adjusting their behavior based on what authorities revealed to the press. Daniel had moved to explore one of the smaller tunnels branching off from the main chamber, and his voice echoed back with a note of concern that immediately drew Marcus's attention. The side passage extended perhaps 50 feet into the mountain before terminating in what appeared to be a storage area. Here, someone had excavated a shallow alcove in the wall and fitted it with metal shelving units, the kind typically found in commercial storage facilities or warehouses. Most of the shelves stood empty now, but several still contained items that provided additional insight into the occupants' activities and priorities. Canned goods lined one shelf, the labels faded but the containers still intact despite their age. Marcus recognized brands of vegetables, beans, and soup that suggested the stockpile had been assembled over an extended period from multiple shopping trips to different stores. Someone had been careful to rotate their supplies, with the oldest expiration dates at the front and newer items pushed toward the back. Another shelf held medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, pain relievers, and other over-the-counter medications still in their original packaging. A third shelf contained what appeared to be personal hygiene items, though many had been removed, leaving only rectangular dust-free spaces that indicated where bottles and containers had once stood. But it was the lowest shelf that held the most disturbing discovery. Here, someone had stored several dozen batteries of various sizes, along with replacement bulbs for flashlights, coils of wire, and electronic components that suggested either technical expertise or paranoid preparation for equipment failures. Behind these items, pushed toward the back of the shelf and partially hidden by a cardboard box, Daniel discovered 3 spiral-bound notebooks with water-stained covers. He carefully extracted them and brought them back to the main chamber where better light allowed for examination. Marcus opened the first notebook with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to maintain composure. The pages contained handwritten entries, though the writing style and organization suggested something between a diary and a planning document. The earliest dated entry was from 12 years ago, a brief notation about establishing primary cache and securing secondary exit route. Subsequent entries detailed supply acquisitions, noting specific items purchased and the stores where transactions had occurred. The author had been methodical about avoiding patterns, never shopping at the same location twice in succession, and always paying cash to prevent electronic tracking. As Marcus flipped through the pages, a profile of the author began to emerge. This individual possessed intelligence and discipline, planning their activities with military-style precision and maintaining detailed records of every action and decision. They had established multiple storage locations both inside and outside the mine, creating redundant systems that would allow them to survive even if one cache was discovered or compromised. Weather patterns were noted, along with observations about patrol schedules and law enforcement activity in the surrounding area. The author had been monitoring the authorities as carefully as the authorities had presumably been searching for them. The second notebook contained more personal reflections, though still written in a guarded style that suggested the author understood these pages might eventually be read by others. Entries discussed the psychological challenges of isolation, strategies for maintaining mental discipline during extended periods alone, and philosophical musings about justice, society, and personal freedom. The writing revealed an educated mind, with references to literature and historical figures that suggested either formal education or extensive self-directed learning. Yet underlying the intellectual content was a current of anger and resentment, carefully controlled but unmistakable in its intensity. Daniel had continued exploring while Marcus examined the notebooks, and his voice called out from another side tunnel with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. Marcus secured the notebooks under his arm and moved quickly toward his brother's location, his flashlight beam bouncing off the irregular walls as he navigated the narrow passage. This tunnel had been modified even more extensively than the main chamber, with wooden support beams installed at regular intervals and the floor leveled to create easier passage. Electric lights had been mounted to the ceiling every 10 feet, connected to the conduit system they had observed earlier, though the bulbs had long since been removed. The passage opened into a smaller chamber that served a very specific purpose: communication and surveillance. Someone had mounted multiple battery-powered radios to a wooden shelf, along with a police scanner and what appeared to be a shortwave receiver. All the equipment had been removed, leaving only the mounting brackets and connection points, but the setup suggested sophisticated monitoring capability. A filing cabinet stood against one wall, its drawers partially open and mostly empty, though a few forgotten papers remained in the bottom drawer. Daniel pulled these out and spread them across the top of the cabinet for examination. The documents appeared to be printouts from public records databases, property ownership information for parcels surrounding the mine location, and topographical maps with various routes marked in different colors. Someone had been conducting reconnaissance on the area, identifying multiple escape routes and establishing familiarity with the terrain that would have provided significant advantage if pursuit ever came close to discovering their location. The level of preparation and attention to detail spoke to either extensive experience with evasion or paranoid obsession with security, possibly both. Marcus checked his watch and realized they had been exploring the mine for nearly 2 hours. The late afternoon sun would be setting soon, and neither brother felt comfortable remaining in this place after dark, especially given what they had discovered. They needed to report their findings to the authorities, but both men understood that doing so would likely mean the end of their investment and possibly entangle them in a complicated legal situation. The mine they had purchased as a potential business opportunity had transformed into something far more problematic, a crime scene that would need to be processed and investigated by law enforcement. The decision to contact the sheriff's department came easier than Marcus had anticipated. Despite the financial implications and the complications it would bring to their plans, neither brother could justify concealing what they had found. Whatever had transpired in this mine represented serious criminal activity, and the newspaper clippings suggested at least one person's disappearance might be connected to the site. They gathered the notebooks and several of the more significant items they had discovered, carefully documenting their locations with photographs taken on Daniel's phone before disturbing anything further. The drive back to town took place mostly in silence, both brothers processing what they had witnessed and contemplating the implications. The mine had been sealed deliberately, transformed into a hideout by someone who had clearly spent considerable time and resources creating a survivable underground environment. The question that haunted Marcus as they navigated the deteriorating road back toward civilization was whether the occupant had left voluntarily or whether something more sinister had occurred in those dark tunnels beneath the mountain. The sheriff's department occupied a modest building on the main street of the county seat, a two-story structure that also housed the emergency dispatch center and county jail. Marcus and Daniel arrived just after 6 in the evening, finding the front desk staffed by a young deputy who initially seemed skeptical of their story. His attitude changed dramatically when Marcus produced the notebooks and explained where they had been found. Within minutes, they were seated in an interview room speaking with Sheriff Thomas Brennan, a man in his late 50s whose weathered face and sharp eyes suggested decades of experience dealing with the unexpected. Sheriff Brennan listened to their account without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking clarifying questions about locations and timeline. When Marcus described the newspaper clippings and the underground living quarters, something shifted in the sheriff's expression, a flash of recognition that suggested this information connected with something he already knew. He excused himself briefly and returned with a thick case file, the tab labeled with a name and case number that meant nothing to the brothers. The sheriff opened the file and extracted a photograph, sliding it across the table for them to examine. The image showed a man in his early 40s with dark hair and intense eyes, photographed in what appeared to be a booking photo from a previous arrest. Sheriff Brennan identified him as Robert Vance, a former aerospace engineer who had disappeared 13 years earlier while under investigation for industrial espionage and theft of proprietary information. Vance had been questioned but not arrested, and authorities were preparing a warrant when he vanished completely, leaving behind his apartment fully furnished and his vehicle parked at a commuter train station. The investigation into Vance's disappearance had consumed considerable resources in its first year, with authorities checking airports, border crossings, and known associates across multiple states. Despite extensive effort, no trace of him had emerged. His bank accounts remained untouched, his credit cards inactive, and he made no contact with family members or former colleagues. The prevailing theory had been that Vance had left the country using false identification, possibly selling the stolen information to foreign interests and living comfortably somewhere beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The idea that he might have been living underground in an abandoned mine less than 100 miles from where he disappeared had never been seriously considered. Sheriff Brennan explained that Vance's background made him uniquely qualified to create the kind of sophisticated hideout the brothers had described. His engineering expertise would have enabled him to assess the structural integrity of the mine, install electrical systems safely, and solve the various technical challenges associated with underground habitation. His military service in his younger years had provided survival training and familiarity with operational security principles. Combined with the proceeds from selling stolen intellectual property, something investigators believed had occurred before his disappearance, Vance would have possessed both the capability and the resources to disappear effectively. The sheriff made several phone calls, speaking in the clipped, efficient language of law enforcement coordination. Within an hour, additional personnel began arriving, deputies from the county, detectives from the state police, and eventually 2 federal agents whose arrival in unmarked sedans suggested the case had interstate or national security implications. The brothers found themselves repeating their story multiple times to different audiences, each retelling requiring them to recall additional details and answer progressively more technical questions about exactly what they had observed and where specific items had been located. By midnight, a plan had been established for a comprehensive investigation of the mine site. A forensic team would be assembled to process the location, including specialists in underground crime scenes and evidence recovery. The brothers would return to the site at first light to guide investigators to the entrance and provide detailed information about the layout based on their exploration. Marcus and Daniel were advised to secure lodging in town for the night, as the investigation would likely take several days and their continued cooperation would be essential. The motel room where they eventually tried to sleep offered little comfort, both brothers lying awake and replaying the day's discoveries in their minds. Marcus found himself thinking about Robert Vance, trying to imagine the mindset of someone who would choose to live underground for years rather than face justice for his crimes. The notebooks had revealed a disciplined, intelligent individual who had nonetheless made choices that led to complete isolation from society. Had Vance remained in that mine for the entire 13 years since his disappearance, or had he eventually moved on to another location, abandoning his carefully prepared hideout for reasons they might never understand? The following morning arrived with gray skies and the threat of rain, weather that seemed appropriate for what lay ahead. The brothers met the investigative team at the sheriff's department, where they were introduced to the various specialists who would be conducting the search. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist from the State University, explained that her presence was precautionary. Any underground site that had been sealed for an extended period needed to be checked for human remains before other investigative activities could proceed safely. Her matter-of-fact delivery did nothing to ease the knot of anxiety that had formed in Marcus's stomach. The convoy of vehicles that made the journey to the mine site included the brothers' truck, 3 sheriff's department SUVs, an evidence response van, and the unmarked federal vehicles. The deteriorating road that had seemed merely inconvenient the previous day now appeared actively hostile, forcing the procession to slow to a crawl in several locations where erosion had created dangerous ruts and washouts. Marcus couldn't help wondering how Vance had initially discovered this location, and how he had transported the supplies and equipment necessary to establish his underground refuge without drawing attention. At the mine entrance, the investigation began with methodical precision. Crime scene technicians established a perimeter and processing protocol, photographing and documenting everything before any personnel entered the tunnels. Portable lighting systems were set up to eliminate the need for flashlights, and generators hummed to life, providing power for the various electronic equipment that would be used during the search. Dr. Chen entered first, accompanied by 2 technicians, their mission to clear the site or identify any human remains that might be present. The brothers waited outside with Sheriff Brennan, who had produced a thermos of coffee that they shared in paper cups while watching the entrance. The sheriff revealed additional information about the Vance case, details that painted a more complex picture of the man who had disappeared. Robert Vance had been a brilliant engineer whose work on satellite communication systems had been considered groundbreaking within the aerospace industry. But personal problems, a contentious divorce, financial difficulties stemming from poor investment decisions, and conflicts with management over intellectual property rights, had gradually eroded his stability and judgment. When Vance's employer discovered that proprietary information was being offered for sale to competitors, an internal investigation quickly identified him as the likely source. Rather than immediately involving law enforcement, the company had attempted to handle the matter quietly, hoping to minimize public relations damage. This delay had given Vance time to realize he was under investigation and to make preparations for his disappearance. By the time authorities became involved and began building a criminal case, Vance had already established his underground hideout and was preparing to vanish from the normal world. Dr. Chen emerged from the mine after nearly 90 minutes, her expression neutral but her body language suggesting tension. She approached Sheriff Brennan and spoke quietly, though Marcus was close enough to hear the essentials of her report. No human remains had been found in the main chambers or the passages they had explored thus far. However, several of the deeper tunnels remained unexplored, their entrances blocked by what appeared to be deliberate cave-ins. These areas would require specialized equipment and expertise to access safely, and Dr. Chan recommended bringing in mining safety engineers before attempting any further penetration into those sections. With the site cleared for general investigation, the full team began their systematic processing of the underground facility. Marcus and Daniel were invited to accompany them, providing guidance based on their previous exploration and answering questions about what had changed between their initial discovery and the current state of the site. The brothers watched as technicians carefully collected items for evidence analysis, photographing each object in place before removing it and documenting its location in detailed diagrams and notes. The federal agents who had arrived the previous evening focused primarily on the communications area, examining the mounting brackets where radios and monitoring equipment had been installed. They seemed particularly interested in the range and capabilities suggested by the setup, discussing among themselves the possibility that Vance had been monitoring law enforcement communications and potentially intercepting other electronic signals. One agent commented that the location's elevation and isolation would have provided excellent conditions for radio reception, allowing someone with the right equipment to monitor activity across a wide area. In the storage alcove, investigators discovered several items that the brothers had missed during their initial exploration. Behind the shelving units, someone had concealed a small waterproof container filled with identification documents, all bearing Robert Vance's photograph but different names and biographical information. The quality of the forgeries appeared professional, suggesting either sophisticated criminal connections or advanced technical skill in document creation. Also hidden in the alcove was a laptop computer, its battery long dead but the device potentially containing valuable information about Vance's activities during his time underground. The notebooks Marcus had collected received particular attention from a criminal psychologist who had joined the investigation team. Dr. Raymond Foster spent several hours examining the handwritten entries, occasionally reading passages aloud and offering commentary on what they revealed about the author's mental state and reasoning processes. According to Dr. Foster, the writings demonstrated someone maintaining remarkable psychological discipline despite extreme isolation, but also showed subtle signs of deteriorating cognition in the later entries, repetitive thoughts, increasingly paranoid observations, and breaks in the otherwise methodical logic that characterized the earlier pages. The final entry in the most recent notebook was dated 6 months earlier, a brief notation that simply read, "Time to move on," followed by a list of items to be retrieved before departure. This entry suggested that Vance had left the mine voluntarily rather than being discovered or forced to abandon his hideout. But it raised new questions about his current location and activities. Had he established another refuge elsewhere, or had he finally decided to leave the country and start a new life beyond the reach of American authorities? As the day progressed and the investigation continued, a more complete picture of Vance's underground existence began to emerge. He had lived in the mine for at least 8 years based on the dated entries in his notebooks, emerging periodically to acquire supplies and presumably to access internet connections for monitoring news and conducting research. His routine had been carefully structured to minimize risk of detection, shopping trips to distant towns where he would be unlikely to encounter anyone familiar with his previous life, always paying cash and avoiding establishments with extensive surveillance systems, varying his schedule and routes to prevent pattern recognition. The electrical system that had powered his lights and equipment proved to be more sophisticated than the brothers had initially realized. Vance had installed a series of deep-cycle batteries in a sealed chamber off one of the side tunnels, charging them using portable solar panels that he had presumably set up above ground during daylight hours before concealing them again. This system had provided reliable power while leaving no connection to the commercial electrical grid that might have revealed his location. The engineering was elegant and effective, exactly what one might expect from someone with Vance's technical background and training. But the most significant discovery came late in the afternoon when investigators finally cleared one of the partially collapsed tunnels that had been inaccessible during the brothers' initial exploration. This passage led to a deeper chamber that Vance had used for his most sensitive materials and activities. Here, technicians found a sophisticated document production setup including a professional quality printer, laminating equipment, and supplies for creating false identification. Also present were several external hard drives, their contents encrypted but potentially containing detailed records of Vance's activities during his years underground and possibly evidence of additional crimes beyond the industrial espionage that had originally sparked the investigation. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery of surveillance photographs, dozens of images showing various individuals going about their daily activities, apparently photographed without their knowledge or consent. The subjects included former colleagues from Vance's time in the aerospace industry, law enforcement personnel who had been involved in the investigation of his disappearance, and several individuals whose connection to Vance remained unclear. The photographs suggested that Vance had maintained active interest in the lives of certain people from his previous existence, possibly monitoring them for security purposes or perhaps nursing grudges against those he blamed for his situation. Sheriff Brennan studied these photographs with visible concern, recognizing several of the individuals pictured. He immediately contacted those who could be identified, warning them that they had been under surveillance and advising increased security awareness. The discovery elevated the case from a simple matter of a fugitive's abandoned hideout to something potentially more sinister, evidence of ongoing stalking behavior and possible planning for future criminal activity. The question of Vance's current location and intentions became even more urgent given this new information. The investigation of the mine site continued for 3 more days, with specialists systematically processing every chamber and passage that could be safely accessed. Additional items emerged from the depths, more notebooks documenting Vance's thoughts and activities, detailed maps showing surveillance routes he had established in nearby towns, and financial records indicating he had managed to maintain access to funds throughout his time in hiding, likely through cryptocurrency transactions and other difficult-to-trace financial mechanisms. The forensic computer specialists who examined Vance's laptop and external hard drives eventually succeeded in breaking the encryption, revealing a treasure trove of information about his activities during the missing years. He had maintained detailed logs of every supply run, every news article he had accessed, and every person he had observed. More concerningly, he had continued his research in aerospace engineering, maintaining digital files containing technical information that appeared to have been acquired illegally from multiple sources. The evidence suggested that Vance had not simply been hiding from justice. He had remained active in espionage activities, stealing and consolidating information that could have significant value to foreign intelligence services or private competitors. Federal investigators became increasingly dominant in the case as the full scope of Vance's activities became clear. What had begun as a local matter of a fugitive's discovered hideout had evolved into a national security investigation involving multiple agencies and potential international implications. The brothers found themselves largely excluded from the later phases of the investigation, their role as property owners becoming less relevant as the site transformed into a classified federal crime scene. The question of what would happen to the mine property itself remained unresolved for several weeks after the investigation concluded its on-site phase. Marcus and Daniel found themselves in a strange legal limbo, technically owning property that had been used for serious federal crimes but bearing no personal responsibility for those activities. The county prosecutor assured them they faced no criminal liability, but the property's future remained uncertain as various government agencies debated whether it needed to be seized as evidence or could be released back to the brothers' control. The media attention that inevitably followed the discovery brought unwanted publicity to both the brothers and the investigation. News outlets from across the country reported on the underground fugitive hideout, often embellishing details and speculating about aspects of the case that remained unclear even to investigators. Marcus and Daniel declined interview requests, preferring to maintain privacy while waiting for the legal and procedural complications to resolve themselves. Their original vision of purchasing an investment property and developing it into a profitable venture seemed almost laughably naive given everything that had transpired. Robert Vance himself remained at large, his current location unknown despite the renewed investigative effort that followed the discovery of his abandoned hideout. Authorities theorized that he had left the country, possibly traveling to Southeast Asia or South America where American law enforcement would have limited reach. The 6-month gap between his final notebook entry and the brothers' discovery of the site suggested he had successfully established himself elsewhere, potentially with a new identity and continued access to the financial resources he had accumulated through his various illegal activities. Sheriff Brennan maintained contact with the brothers as the investigation progressed through its administrative phases, occasionally sharing updates when information could be released without compromising ongoing operations. He explained that the FBI had identified several foreign intelligence services that had likely purchased information from Vance during his time underground, though proving these transactions and extraditing anyone who might have been involved would be extremely difficult. The case had expanded far beyond the original industrial espionage charges, now encompassing multiple federal offenses and potential violations of national security law. For Marcus and Daniel, the experience had been transformative in ways they were still processing months after the initial discovery. Their impulsive auction purchase had connected them to a complex criminal case that intersected with national security concerns and raised troubling questions about how someone could effectively disappear in the modern age despite extensive surveillance capabilities and investigative resources. The mine, which they had imagined might be converted into a tourist attraction or storage facility, instead represented a monument to one individual's determination to evade justice and maintain an existence outside the normal bounds of society. The notebooks and other materials recovered from the site provided insight into Vance's psychology and motivations, painting a portrait of someone who combined remarkable technical capability with fundamental moral failures. He had possessed the intelligence and discipline to create and maintain an invisible existence for years, but had chosen to use those abilities in service of criminal activities rather than finding legitimate solutions to his problems. Dr. Foster, the criminal psychologist, suggested in his final report that Vance represented a new category of fugitive, the highly educated, technologically sophisticated individual who could leverage modern resources to effectively vanish while remaining active in illegal enterprises. The sealed mine that had attracted the brothers' interest at a county auction had concealed secrets far beyond anything they could have imagined when they placed their winning bid. It had served as Robert Vance's home, fortress, and operational base for nearly a decade, a carefully engineered refuge that demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of attempting to live outside the normal structures of society. The discovery had ended Vance's occupation of the space but had not brought him to justice, leaving investigators with evidence of his crimes but no ability to apprehend the perpetrator. As the investigation gradually wound down and the property began the slow process of being released from federal control, Marcus found himself returning to the site occasionally, standing at the entrance and contemplating what had transpired in the darkness beyond. The mine represented both historical industrial activity and more recent criminal exploitation, layers of human activity stacked across decades in a single location. Vance had chosen this place because of its isolation and abandonment, never imagining that a random auction and the curiosity of two brothers might eventually expose his carefully hidden world. The case remained officially open, with periodic updates as investigators pursued new leads or identified additional evidence in the materials recovered from the mine. Vance's face appeared on wanted posters and in databases accessed by law enforcement agencies worldwide, though most officials privately acknowledged that capturing him would require either exceptional luck or a significant mistake on his part. He had demonstrated too much skill at evasion and had too many resources at his disposal to be easily apprehended, especially if he had successfully established himself in a jurisdiction with limited cooperation with American authorities. For the local community, the discovery became part of local lore, a story repeated and embellished in conversations at diners and hardware stores across the county. The sealed mine that had been just another abandoned industrial site mentioned in auction catalogs had transformed into a landmark, its location known to curious locals who occasionally drove the rough road to glimpse the entrance where such dramatic events had unfolded. Law enforcement maintained periodic surveillance of the site, recognizing the unlikely but possible chance that Vance might someday return to retrieve something he had left behind or to revisit the place that had served as his home during his years underground. The brothers eventually received clear title to the property once federal prosecutors determined that continued seizure was unnecessary for prosecution purposes. But the question of what to do with a mine that had housed a fugitive's elaborate hideout remained unresolved. Converting it to commercial use seemed impossible given the location's notoriety, and the cost of properly securing or filling the passages exceeded any potential revenue the property might generate. Marcus and Daniel found themselves owning a unique piece of real estate that was simultaneously fascinating and completely unmarketable. In the end, they donated the property to the county with the understanding that it would be properly sealed and maintained as a safety precaution, preventing unauthorized access while preserving the site should future investigative needs arise. The donation provided them with a modest tax benefit and relieved them of the ongoing liability associated with maintaining and securing the location. The county accepted the transfer and immediately contracted with specialists to install proper barriers and warning systems, ensuring that curious individuals would not attempt to explore the tunnels and potentially endanger themselves. The story of the sealed mine and its fugitive occupant eventually faded from immediate public attention, replaced by newer scandals and more current events. But for those directly involved, the brothers who made the discovery, the investigators who processed the scene, the specialists who analyzed the evidence, it remained a memorable case that illustrated how determined individuals could exploit the gaps and limitations in modern surveillance systems to maintain hidden existences even in an age of pervasive digital tracking and monitoring. Robert Vance's ultimate fate remained unknown, his story incomplete despite the massive investigative effort that had been dedicated to understanding his activities and locating his current position. He existed now primarily as a file in law enforcement databases, a wanted poster in federal offices, and a cautionary tale about the challenges of bringing sophisticated criminals to justice in an interconnected but still imperfect world. Whether he continued his illegal activities from some new location or had genuinely disappeared into legitimate obscurity, no one could say with certainty. The mine itself stood as testament to what had transpired there, its passages and chambers documented in extensive photographs and diagrams but now sealed against access. Future generations might eventually forget the specific details of who had lived there and why, but the physical space remained, a monument to one individual's determination to evade consequences and the two brothers whose curiosity had finally brought that hidden world into the light. If you've made it this far, you're clearly invested in these incredible stories. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that super thanks button to support more content like this. We're constantly bringing you the most fascinating real-life mysteries and discoveries from around the world, and your support makes it all possible. Also, we'd love to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below and let's see how far our community reaches. ****. The months following the donation of the property brought an unexpected coda to the investigation that had consumed so much attention and resources. Sheriff Brennan contacted Marcus on a cold morning in late autumn, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately commanded attention. New information had emerged, not from continued investigation of the mine site itself, but from an entirely unexpected source halfway across the world. A routine customs inspection at a port in Singapore had flagged a shipping container being sent to an electronics firm in Vietnam, and among the legitimate commercial goods, inspectors had discovered sophisticated communication equipment and encrypted data storage devices that bore serial numbers matching items reported stolen from American aerospace contractors over the past decade. The discovery had prompted cooperation between American federal agencies and Singaporean authorities, leading to surveillance of the recipient company and its principals. Within weeks, investigators identified connections to a technical consultant who matched Robert Vance's general description and who had been living in Ho Chi Minh City under an assumed identity for approximately 6 months, exactly the time frame since his final notebook entry at the mine. Vietnamese authorities, responding to an official request from American law enforcement, conducted their own investigation and eventually detained the individual for immigration violations, providing American agents with an opportunity to confirm his identity. The man detained in Vietnam was indeed Robert Vance, now using the name David Richardson and claiming to be a Canadian citizen specializing in satellite communication systems. His fraudulent documentation was sophisticated enough to withstand casual inspection but fell apart under detailed scrutiny by experts familiar with authentic Canadian identity documents. Vance had aged noticeably since his last known photograph, his hair now gray and his face bearing the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years under constant stress and limited medical care. But dental records and fingerprint analysis confirmed his identity beyond any doubt, bringing to a close the years-long manhunt that had intensified following the discovery of his abandoned underground refuge. Extradition proceedings began immediately, though the legal complexities of removing Vance from Vietnam to face charges in the United States proved more challenging than investigators had initially anticipated. Vietnamese law required extensive documentation and judicial review before any individual could be transferred to foreign custody, and Vance's attorney, a local lawyer with limited experience in international cases, filed multiple appeals and procedural challenges that delayed the process for months. Meanwhile, American prosecutors assembled the comprehensive case they would present upon his return, incorporating evidence from the mine site with documentation of his continued illegal activities during his time as a fugitive. The brothers followed these developments through periodic updates from Sheriff Brennan and occasional media reports that tracked the extradition proceedings. Marcus found himself experiencing conflicting emotions about Vance's capture: satisfaction that the man who had used their property for criminal purposes would finally face justice, but also a strange sense of anticlimax given how thoroughly the case had already disrupted their lives and plans. Daniel expressed relief that the matter was finally approaching resolution, hoping that Vance's apprehension would allow them to move beyond the notoriety their chance discovery had brought them. Vance's eventual return to American custody occurred on a gray winter morning nearly 18 months after the brothers had first broken the padlock on the mine entrance. Federal agents escorted him off a commercial flight at an East Coast airport, where he was immediately transported to a detention facility pending trial. Media coverage of his arrival showed a man who appeared diminished from the confident engineer whose earlier photographs filled the case files. His posture slumped, his expression resigned, the bravado that might have sustained him during his years underground now completely absent. The trial itself attracted significant attention both for the technical complexity of the charges and for the unusual circumstances of Vance's years as a fugitive. Prosecutors presented the evidence recovered from the mine in exhaustive detail, calling experts to testify about the sophistication of his underground refuge and the systematic nature of his continued criminal activities. The notebooks became key exhibits, their entries providing a roadmap of Vance's thinking and planning throughout his time in hiding. Defense attorneys attempted to argue that their client's mental state had been compromised by years of isolation, but forensic psychologists testifying for the prosecution noted that his activities required sustained rational planning and execution that contradicted claims of diminished capacity. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including industrial espionage, theft of trade secrets, identity fraud, and multiple violations of national security regulations. The judge, noting both the seriousness of the offenses and the defendant's sustained efforts to evade justice, imposed a sentence of 32 years in federal prison, effectively ensuring that Vance would spend the remainder of his productive life in custody. Additional restitution orders required him to forfeit any assets that could be located and identified, though investigators acknowledged that much of his ill-gotten wealth had likely been hidden in accounts and holdings that might never be recovered. For Marcus and Daniel, Vance's conviction provided a sense of closure to the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with their impulsive decision to bid on an abandoned mine at a county auction. Their initial vision of a quick real estate flip or modest development project had been completely derailed by the discovery of the underground hideout, but the brothers had gained something perhaps more valuable: a profound story about human ingenuity, criminal determination, and the persistent reach of justice even when delayed by years of patient evasion. The mine itself remained county property, properly sealed and marked with warnings against unauthorized entry. Occasionally, Sheriff Brennan received reports of curiosity seekers attempting to access the site, drawn by the notoriety of its history and the dramatic story of what had been discovered there. Each such incident resulted in citations and stern warnings about the dangers of exploring unstable underground spaces, and eventually the county installed more robust barriers and enhanced surveillance to discourage trespassing. The location became something of a local tourist attraction despite the lack of legal access, with visitors photographing themselves near the entrance and sharing images on social media platforms with hashtags referencing the fugitive engineer and his years underground. Marcus occasionally reflected on the series of small decisions and coincidences that had led them to that particular auction, to that specific property, to the precise moment when they broke through the sealed entrance and discovered what lay beyond. Had they arrived at the auction 15 minutes later, they might have missed the mine listing entirely. Had they been less curious about the sealed by previous owner notation, they might have dismissed it as just another deteriorating industrial site. Had the previous owner's padlock been slightly more robust, they might have given up on opening it and simply moved on to other opportunities. Any of these small variations would have left Vance's hideout undiscovered, allowing him to maintain his underground refuge or to abandon it without anyone ever knowing it had existed. The case became a subject of academic study, with criminologists and forensic psychologists analyzing Vance's behavior patterns and the methodology he had employed to remain hidden for so long. Several scholarly articles examined the psychological profile of highly intelligent fugitives and the unique challenges they presented to law enforcement agencies accustomed to pursuing less sophisticated criminals. The mine itself was proposed as a teaching case for courses on crime scene investigation and evidence recovery in challenging environments, though access to the actual site remained prohibited for safety and legal reasons. Years after the initial discovery, Marcus received an unexpected letter from Robert Vance, mailed from the federal prison where he was serving his sentence. The letter, which had been reviewed and cleared by prison authorities before being forwarded, contained no apologies or attempts at justification. Instead, Vance wrote with a kind of detached curiosity about the brothers' experience of discovering his refuge, asking questions about their initial impressions and whether they had understood the full scope of what they were seeing during that first exploration. The tone was that of an engineer discussing a technical project, devoid of remorse but filled with professional interest in how his work had been perceived and interpreted by outsiders. Marcus chose not to respond to the letter, though he kept it filed with the other documentation they had accumulated from the case. Something about Vance's clinical approach to describing his years underground and his continued criminal activities disturbed him profoundly. The man seemed incapable of recognizing the human cost of his actions. The colleagues whose work he had stolen, the national security interests he had compromised, the years of law enforcement resources devoted to locating and apprehending him. For Vance, it had all been an elaborate problem-solving exercise, a technical challenge to be analyzed and optimized without regard for ethical considerations or consequences. Daniel eventually moved to another state, accepting a job opportunity that allowed him to build a career separate from the notoriety that still occasionally attached to their names when people learned of their connection to the sealed mine case. He maintained contact with Marcus but rarely discussed the events that had so dramatically interrupted their plans years earlier. For Daniel, the experience had been educational but ultimately something to be moved beyond, a chapter closed rather than a defining moment to be endlessly revisited and analyzed. Marcus remained in the area, eventually establishing a legitimate real estate investment business that focused on conventional properties without the complications of hidden fugitives or federal investigations. He developed expertise in renovating residential properties and became known for fair dealing and thorough due diligence, skills he had learned the hard way through the mine experience. Occasionally, when meeting new clients or business associates, someone would make the connection between his name and the sealed mine case, leading to conversations that Marcus navigated with practiced grace, sharing the basic story without dwelling on details or encouraging excessive curiosity. Sheriff Brennan retired several years after Vance's conviction, his career culminating in the successful resolution of a case that had remained frustratingly open for more than a decade before the brothers' chance discovery provided the breakthrough investigators needed. In his retirement speech, he mentioned the sealed mine case as an example of how persistence and the willingness to follow unexpected leads could eventually bring even sophisticated criminals to justice. He maintained contact with Marcus, and they occasionally met for coffee to discuss other topics entirely, the shared history of that investigation forming a bond but not defining the entirety of their relationship. The sealed mine gradually faded from public consciousness as newer stories and scandals captured media attention and public imagination. The location itself became less frequently visited as the initial curiosity waned and other attractions drew tourists and curiosity seekers to different destinations. The county's investment in proper barriers and surveillance proved effective, with trespassing incidents declining to near zero as years passed and the site's notoriety diminished. Eventually, the mine entrance became just another feature of the landscape, known primarily to locals and to the occasional researcher investigating the case for academic or journalistic purposes. In the federal prison where he would spend the next 3 decades, Robert Vance settled into the routine of institutional life, his exceptional intelligence finding outlets in teaching other inmates technical skills and assisting with the prison's computer maintenance operations. He became a model prisoner by most accounts, compliant with rules and regulations, though fellow inmates and guards alike noted his fundamental disconnection from normal emotional responses. Vance existed within the prison system but remained somehow separate from it, his mind constantly working on problems and projects that bore no relation to his current circumstances or future prospects. The aerospace industry implemented new security protocols following the revelations about Vance's activities, recognizing that traditional approaches to protecting proprietary information had been inadequate to prevent his systematic theft of technical data. The case became a teaching example in corporate security training, illustrating how insider threats could exploit trust and access to cause damage far exceeding what external hackers or competitors could achieve. Several companies that had been victimized by Vance's espionage activities received portions of the restitution funds, though the amounts recovered represented only a fraction of the actual damages their businesses had suffered. For the intelligence community, the sealed mine case provided valuable insights into how sophisticated individuals could maintain hidden existences even in an age of pervasive surveillance and digital tracking. The analysis of Vance's methodology influenced training programs and investigative protocols, with particular attention paid to his successful exploitation of cash transactions, abandoned infrastructure, and the gaps between different jurisdictions and agencies. The case reinforced the reality that technology alone could not guarantee the apprehension of determined fugitives who combined technical expertise with disciplined operational security. The story of the sealed mine and the fugitive engineer who had called it home eventually found its way into popular culture through books, documentaries, and dramatic adaptations that took varying degrees of liberty with the actual facts. Marcus and Daniel declined participation in most of these projects, unwilling to further commercialize an experience that had already brought them more attention than they desired. They did cooperate with one serious documentary filmmaker whose approach emphasized the investigative and technical aspects of the case rather than sensationalizing the more dramatic elements, resulting in a thoughtful examination of how the discovery unfolded and its broader implications. As years passed and the immediate intensity of the experience faded into memory, Marcus found himself occasionally driving past the road that led to the mine site, though he rarely made the turn that would take him to the actual location. The property represented a pivotal moment in his life, a convergence of chance and consequence that had redirected his path in ways both obvious and subtle. He had learned lessons about due diligence, about the complexity of human behavior, about how the past could intrude dramatically into the present in the most unexpected ways. These insights informed his approach to business and life, making him more thoughtful and deliberate in his decisions while maintaining the curiosity and willingness to take calculated risks that had led him to that auction in the first place. The sealed mine stood now as a monument to multiple stories. The original miners who had excavated the tunnel seeking valuable ore, the fugitive engineer who had transformed it into an elaborate refuge, the brothers who had discovered its secrets, and the investigators who had ultimately brought those secrets to light and pursued justice despite years of delay and frustration. Each layer of activity had left its mark on the physical space, creating a complex archaeological record of human ambition, desperation, ingenuity, and determination across different eras and circumstances. In the end, the story of the sealed mine offered no simple moral or easy conclusion. It demonstrated both the remarkable capabilities of human intelligence when fully applied to a focused objective and the tragic waste that occurred when those capabilities were directed toward criminal ends rather than legitimate pursuits. Robert Vance had possessed gifts that might have contributed significantly to technological progress and human knowledge, but he had chosen instead to use them in service of theft, espionage, and evasion, ultimately spending his prime years hiding underground and his later years imprisoned for his crimes. The brothers' role in the story remained that of accidental discoverers, individuals who had stumbled into extraordinary circumstances through a combination of curiosity, opportunity, and coincidence. They had made the ethical choice to report what they found rather than concealing it or attempting to exploit it for personal gain, and that decision had ultimately enabled justice to be served even if it had complicated their own plans and aspirations. Their experience became a reminder that ordinary people could become crucial participants in significant events simply by being in the right place at the right time and making the right choices when confronted with unexpected challenges. Thank you so much for watching this incredible journey unfold. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and consider leaving a super thanks. Your support directly helps us create more amazing content like this. And before you go, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We have viewers all around the globe, and we love seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and remember that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are hiding in the most unexpected places.